Welcome to Charles Dickens, A Brain on Fire, a series that digs deep into the life and works of one of the greatest novelists of all time. Hello everyone, today's guest is the celebrated author of Jane Austen, The Secret Radical, a book described as a sublime piece of literary detective work. Now our guest has turned her unflinching gaze upon the life and lies of Charles Dickens, a copy of which I do not have, because it has not been published yet. So I'm thrilled to have this exclusive chat with her about her book, and also Jane Austen, who, as you will hear, is never far off as a presence in the room. The next voice you will hear is the brilliant Dr. Helena Kelly.
So you're a kind of closet Austenite, are you?
Yeah, I think so. I think because I remember doing Emma at school for GCSE, and I remember that there was this expectation that this book was for the girls and that the boys were going to find it really boring and weren't going to engage. And we all ended up really getting into it, especially once we discovered her narrative voice, and how funny it was. And I did a Northanger Abbey a few years ago for Salisbury Playhouse, toured around with that.
That's always one I always used to find it really difficult to teach, because it's so kind of working out what the tone is, and that sort of, it's a very slippery book.
Yes.
I've never actually seen it on stage. I've seen lots of other Austen novels dramatized. Yeah. I wonder how it kind of, because it's such a meta novelistic novel.
Yeah. So I was playing the dastardly John Thorpe. So I had to, but there were sections where we kind of we morphed into characters from the Mysteries of Udolpho. So that was quite fun. So it's sort of So Catherine's imagination. We had these kinds of weird kind of dream sequences where we had a very simple minimalist set as well, loads of doors, the doors to the pump room or something, and they were just in a line, and they would flick open and stuff like that, and we'd have. So it was really fun. We kept it. I think it was kept really simple, but I think it came across very well.
Yeah.
Anyway, and I really completely realised I didn't answer your question about why on the podcast. So basically, my background to Dickens is I've done, over the last few years, I've done quite a few adaptations. I've adapted down quite a lot of them, and I've done them as kind of readings and performances and things. And I've always really liked him. And I just sort of thought that having sort of made a little bit of a kind of impression in some of the Dickens fraternity, I thought that I was sort of in a good position to maybe try and get the conversation going a little bit about him. And actually, I have a strong sense that despite who he is and everything, there isn't really very much in the podcast world on him.
It seems to me that it's a very kind of ossified conversation. So it's kind of got very stuck, just presenting over again all the things that we know. Oh, it's the boot polish factory. Oh, it's Ellen Ternan. And not delving any deeper or further. It's a very kind of, I suppose, a bit like with Austen, there are some very set parameters culturally for what you think about and how you kind of view them generally. And Dickens, I think, is a bit, and he's difficult as well, of course, because in a new and thankfully more sensitive age, obviously the racism, the anti-Semitism in particular, is appalling. There's so much, in his writing about characters with disabilities as well, that often now I think makes people quite uncomfortable. So there are almost these kind of flattening forces on discussing him that people are a little maybe anxious, a little uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But I think that discomfort is always worth exploring.
I think so. Yeah, I think what's interesting about him is he's sort of a contradiction, isn't he? I think because I just read Barnaby Rudge and I'd never picked it up. I didn't know anything about it, which is one of the reasons why I read it, because I thought it was almost like a new one because it's never really talked about. And I feel like that Dickens is actually very sensitive in the way that he handles people with mental illness or mental disabilities, which I found very surprising. And I suppose Mr. Dick is another example in David Copperfield.
Yes, I guess that's one of the things that kind of has turned up while I've been when I do research on things. I very much, it's not that I distrust previous scholars, but I think it's always as well to go back and kind of start at the beginning and make sure that you haven't kind of accidentally ended up repeating something that isn't based on anything at all.
Yeah, I caught an interview, I think, with you where you mentioned that one of the steps towards writing the Jane Austen biography that you did was the quote from a student's essay saying about Emma and about Jane Austen saying, I'm going to write a character a heroine that no one will like.
Yeah.
And I used that quote in my essays as well.
People do it all the time because everyone will tell you that it's a quote from Austen. And I mean, if it is, it's not written down anywhere, but it's astonishing how easy it is to realise that you've actually been very confidently, especially when you're teaching, you very confidently say, oh yes, of course, this happened, and so said this, and we know that Jane Austen was secretly engaged with what. We actually don't. For example, the secret engagement story with Austen is her niece saying, oh, well, I read some stuff in my mum's journal, which didn't mention anything explicit, but, you know, she'd also kind of dropped these veiled hints. And so I can declare with absolute certainty that this is what happened. And I don't think actually you can, but biography after biography will be like, oh yes, well, this is when it happened. She had this dark night of the soul, and then we don't actually know that happened. And yet it becomes this kind of absolutely fundamental, kind of foundational. This is something that you build your knowledge of Austen on, and then you're using it, and it just proliferates and proliferates. And I mean, it may have happened, but we're not looking at some kind of really solid, historically factual evidence here.
Yeah, we live in a time where we really rely on people to get to the source of information, don't we? So this is a noble cause that you've undertook, I think.
I suppose the interesting thing with Dickens almost is that it turns out, now that we have access to so many more archives, so I use a lot of newspaper archival research, and it turns out that there are some very important facts about Dickens's own life that he just doesn't ever mention, and that don't kind of filter through to our idea of him. We were talking about Barnaby Rudge and how and Dickens is actually quite nuanced and sensitive presentation of characters who have disabilities. And the really interesting thing is that it's probably the case, or it's very plausibly the case, that he had a sibling who had some form of quite serious disability. This is Harriet Dickens, who most biographers will tell you died when she was a baby. And she didn't die when she was a baby. She died according to the death notices that John Dickens put into the papers, and according to her death certificate, she died when she was 9. So when Charles would have been about 15. Why, yes, that is the age difference in Dombey and Son between Florence and her little brother who dies, just to put that out there. And obviously the main reason that at this point you don't mention a relative who is, born within wedlock is because they have, it could be quite a mild disability. For example, so Austen's brother George also basically never gets mentioned by anybody. And we know that he had some form of, we think that he was deaf and dumb, but that could just be like measles or something. So they're not necessarily an intellectual impairment. But the only reason really for Charles never to mention Harriet's existence, which he never does, is that she had some form of disability, possibly spina bifida. So the baby before Charles, so his older brother, had hydrocephalus, basically died of hydrocephalus. And they tend to be quite interconnected problems, and they can sometimes recur in later pregnancies. So yeah, I think it's quite a small fact, I suppose, in some ways, but actually having that quite plausible suggestion there about the fact of her longer existence, the idea that this is the reason why no one talks about her, then suggests that actually Dickens is writing about disability from a very personal, familial experience of having a sibling with some form of additional needs. And again, when he writes Dombey and Son, a teenage sibling losing a younger one, that's kind of autobiographical to an extent. Like you say, it's that kind of unexpected moments in which he is more sensitive than maybe we've kind of been talking of him as being.
Yes, it's interesting because when you look at the Victorian age, I certainly have an expectation of how people are going to behave en masse. And I remember reading when I was working on The Chimes and adapting that down, the story of Mary Furley, I think if I remember the name right.
She was blind.
I think she was the one that, if I've got the name right, she's the one that tried to drown herself and her
Oh,
child
yes,
in
yes.
the Thames. And just as you were saying, reading the old newspapers and everything, you would have expected huge outcry and indignation, this evil woman. And actually, there's so much sympathy for her from the general public, and she's sentenced to death, and they want her sentence commuted. And I think she's then transported, perhaps. I can't quite remember what happens to her, but it's so interesting. And, people now talking about Black Lives Matter and saying, well, you're applying contemporary ideas to the past and that doesn't work. And then, of course, you realize there's an enormous abolitionist movement that happens at the same time.
Absolutely. The past is people were much nicer and more intelligent and more kind of emotionally sensitive than we give them credit for being, because there's very much this idea that you kind of get it in certain circles that sort of, obviously people didn't realise that having slaves was bad. Like, no, I mean, of course they did. Mm-hmm. Like, people who were involved in the slave trade had nervous breakdowns and then kind of, dedicated the rest of their lives to trying to stop it, because you can't be involved in that kind of thing and not have a normal human response to it, unless you crush it out of yourself entirely. Right? Most people are normal and have kind of normal responses. They're not, that the past isn't as far away as we think. Not always. Sometimes it is.
Yes.
But there's more kind of commonality with now than I think we sometimes accept.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. So I suppose, something I wanted to ask you really straight out. We've kind of fallen into chat already, which I love, which is brilliant. Not even sure if we said hello to each other. Did we say hello?
Not sure we did.
Hello, Helena. Welcome. Welcome to the podcast. But what were the steps that led you towards Dickens?
So I grew up in Rochester. And my parents now, so my parents live in Higham. When they go out on their little daily walk, they go right past Gad's Hill. So my mum's family have kind of lived in the area for kind of centuries and centuries. There was never a moment when I wasn't vaguely aware of Dickens. Obviously, you've got lots of road names. The street names are all Dickensian in lots of the estates. And I always found it kind of slightly odd, I guess, coming from that part of the world, that Dickens is so often talked about as a kind of London writer, because obviously he does set a lot of his novels in London, but he also sets quite a lot of them in and around Rochester, North Kent marshes. And I suppose I was always a bit sort of bemused as to why it was that Medway hadn't ever quite managed to kind of take ownership of him. Obviously, he lives in the area when he's a little boy, goes to the area for his honeymoon, goes to the area on his birthday. I mean, not every single birthday, but I mean, must be at least 1 in 3. He's there, and he'll take friends and show them around. And then obviously he buys the house. So it always seemed to me, kind of from a local point of view, a little bit, I guess, as if London had sort of stolen him. And I always kind of vaguely wondered how that had happened. So the book was originally going to be a geographical biography through places to kind of redress some of that. But then I realised that actually the reason that Chatham in particular, so Chatham's the big dock town next to Rochester, which is where the Dickenses actually lived when Charles was little. The reason that Chatham doesn't really talk about him, even though they redid the dockyard as a big kind of tourist attraction, but it doesn't really talk about the fact that Charles Dickens' dad used to work there. And then as I was kind of starting to pull the geographical references and things together, I realised that probably part of the reason for that is that Dickens actually lies about having grown up in Chatham. He's incredibly evasive about it. So he repeatedly insinuates that he grew up in Rochester instead. So Rochester's the kind of nice cathedral town. And then Chatham, which is right next door, but very much not the same. Even now, pretty rough in places. And certainly kind of the end of the Napoleonic Wars, it was heavily garrisoned, really, really heavily fortified. And he refuses to write about Chatham and hardly ever mentions Chatham in his letters. When he writes this Child's History of England, the big event in Chatham's history, which is when the Dutch sailed up the Medway and burned a substantial amount of the Royal Navy, which was at anchor. And he manages to talk about that without ever mentioning Chatham. There's one brief reference to Chatham in David Copperfield. So David kind of stays there overnight, but he gets cheated by the guy who's like selling secondhand clothes. But interestingly, after John Dickens, so after Charles's father dies, Dickens starts saying, oh, well, I'll write a kind of essay about Chatham Dockyard now. 2 months, not even that, 1 month, I think, after his father has died, he suddenly feels himself able to start mentioning it. Occasionally, I mean, he doesn't do it lots, but he really, really noticeably doesn't do it before his father dies. The interesting thing is that John Dickens worked for the Navy Pay Office, and he was sent down to Chatham probably towards the end of 1817, and we think he left at some point during 1822. But the really interesting thing that kind of doesn't really get talked about very much is that at the beginning of 1822, so on, I believe it was New Year's Day, basically the accountants arrived at the Navy Pay Office, and the boss there, who was a guy called John Slade, had been embezzling like massively on a huge scale. And the accountants arrive and they're like, we'd like to check through your accounts. And he's like, of course. This is Slade. And then he walks out of the office and commits suicide. And there's this big file of kind of information and kind of interviews and things, which you can go and consult in the National Archives, because he'd stolen like thousands of pounds. And they clearly hadn't followed all the rules in the office that they were meant to be following. Turned out everyone knew perfectly well that money had been kind of going out and maybe not coming back, as they had ludicrous amounts of cash. They paid all the sailors. So it was actually kind of a fairly good sized scandal. But John Dickens basically barely gets mentioned. So everyone else in the office is kind of going in and getting interviewed, they know about it, and he doesn't get mentioned at all. There's one very, very faint reference to him as owing Slade money. Slade was one of the many guys that John Dickens owed money to. Although, of course, I mean, with what we've found out about Harriet, if she has, as we assume she must have done, some kind of serious illness, possibly additional needs, then maybe that's the reason why the Dickens family suddenly start hemorrhaging cash during their time in Chatham. That's why they end up in these ongoing financial difficulties, because they've got to care for her.
Yes.
Which is obviously not going to be cheap. Which kind of raises the question, given that there is this very large scandal with a strange kind of silence about John Dickens, did Charles get it into his head, possibly, that his father was somehow involved in the fraud or had informed on his boss? As we know, and as does get mentioned in biographies, Charles's grandpa, Charles Barrow, so his mum's dad, had also had his little sticky fingers in the till, and also stolen a lot of money, embezzled a lot of money, and hopped it to the Isle of Man so that he couldn't be convicted. He was actually convicted in absentia, basically. But so there is a kind of family history of having slightly sticky fingers. So whether Charles kind of has this gnawing anxiety that his dad's involved in this, and so avoids quite carefully talking about his family's connection to the dockyard until his dad's dead, at which point he finally feels that he can kind of...
Yes, his dad's dead, but also he himself is very well established. So he probably feels he has the confidence in having sort of remade himself after having been, I guess, ashamed of home.
Yeah, so it's what I started thinking about was, if he's kind of fibbing about this, and there's a good reason why he might have been fibbing about this, he wants to take control of what the press are going to say about him. And you're right, I suppose you're right to talk about him being established, but I think right from the beginning, that fame was a very kind of two-edged sword for him. Obviously, financially great, loves the praise, of course he does, but he's also, I think, very, very uneasy about what the press are going to say, what they might dig up, possibly, what they might find out about him, how they're going to present that, and whether that will then damage him in some way or other. There are quite a lot of fibs, and it's not just Ellen Turner that he lies about. There are a lot of things that he doesn't want to share with people, and he's not prepared to let people into certain aspects of his family history, of his kind of own experience. And I guess another example, the dreadful anti-Semitism, not just in Oliver Twist, but in the Old Curiosity Shop as well, for my money, is much worse on that front. That then gets complicated when, again, surprise, the archives reveal that actually his uncle and a load of step-cousins are Jewish and still practicing, and that he probably, I think, again, I mean, if he didn't know when he was a child that they were, the odds are that he would have worked it out when he was older. I don't see that as an adult he could have been unaware of what these relatives' ethnic and religious background was.
Yes.
Whether he was aware as a child is, I suppose, slightly more open to question. These are the cousins who owned the blacking factory, who were involved in the blacking factory, which is obviously not making the anti-Semitism any less awful, but does make it kind of, I think, much, much more complicated, that he's sort of writing these stories about how terrible Jewish people are.
Yeah.
When he had Jewish relatives himself who he seems to have got on perfectly well with and been kind of had quite close and affectionate relationships, that it's again that total contrast between one side of him and another side, and there's you keep coming up against places where the facts that we now know actually seem not to fit with the Dickens that we thought we were familiar with, and that we knew everything about him.
Yes.
And that actually new information kind of suggests that maybe we don't, and that there are different angles and there's more complicated things to unpackage, I suppose.
Well, yeah, that sounds very much like that's what you're up to, and I think you'll appreciate this very scholarly question that I'm about to ask you, which is, how do you feel about him personally? Because I read some responses to your Jane Austen biography, The Secret Radical, and it made me laugh. I can't remember which article it was, and it's completely fine, but someone seemed to have a problem with you referring to Jane Austen as Jane, as if you would dare to make her a person.
I was told to do that by my editor.
But that's what makes it such an engaging book, and you really get close to the person. First name terms are fine. You've put the time in. You've got to know her. But I feel like she comes across rather saintly. I don't think she really puts her foot wrong, as far as I can see anything about her. But Dickens is harder, isn't he? I
guess the thing with Austen is that we don't know all that much about her life. You know, we have some of her letters, but by no means all of them. Supposedly this is because her sister kind of, burns all the unacceptable ones. It's quite difficult to find out that much about her, because she left, aside from the novels, she leaves so little mark. Before she dies, I think her name only once appears in the press, like it's and that's in like a subscription list. But she's not a public person. And so you never see her maybe doing stuff that doesn't stand the test of time terribly well. And Dickens just does so much. There are so many references to him, thousands of letters. This is despite the fact that he too destroyed a lot of correspondence. He did it himself. But he was such a bad husband. Fundamentally, I mean, he was a bad husband. But on the other hand, when you kind of look at the context of his marriage to Catherine, of kind of why he would have wanted to marry her, the pressures that were put on them were such that I'm not sure any marriage would have survived anywhere. It almost wouldn't have mattered if he'd been more properly in love with her than he wasn't. He was sort of quite half-heartedly in love with her. Within the first year after their marriage, 9 months basically, they've got a baby, and he's nationally famous, and there's no time for them to kind of really develop their relationship. I think there's obviously lots and lots of ideas about what Dickens's relationship was with his sisters-in-law. So
yes, would he have been happy to have married all three of them? Would that have completed him if he'd married Catherine?
All four. He writes this. So there are four. The fourth one is a lot younger and can't stand him. They by the end they absolutely hated each other. The youngest is Helen Hogarth, and she's so much younger that she's only really properly grown up after Dickens' marriage has broken down. But no, there's a letter in which Dickens like writes to one of his acquaintances, being like, "I cannot believe you had Helen to your house. Like you just it's utterly unacceptable." But he writes this just before he gets married. One of his short stories is called The Four Sisters. Oh, yes. And it's all about these kind of four sisters who live together in this house. And then this man comes along and moves in, and no one's sure which of the sisters has got married, because, you know, when they do the wedding ceremony, they all kind of answer together. And has he married all of them? Is he like polygamous? And then finally you all the neighbours work out which one he's married, because one of them has a baby. And there's some psychosexual stuff in there that we probably don't want to dig into too much. But also, the law on marriage changed the year that he got engaged, which then made it illegal for you to marry your sisters-in-law. It hadn't been approved of before, but it happened quite a lot. That obviously there's so much maternal mortality that it was not unusual for a man to marry one sister, have her die on him, and then marry her sister. When Dickens kind of got engaged. So I think that, yes, he would probably have been happy to marry. They were almost interchangeable in his mind. I think he liked this kind of large, warm, more secure family. He liked that, you know, her dad was present and involved, which his own father wasn't. His own father had a bit of a tendency to kind of disappear whenever there were problems. And he wanted the Hogarth family as much as anything, I think. But then his circumstances changed so completely during those first months of marriage that he's someone totally different, even before they've got out of the starting gates. But how easy was it at that point for people to get to know each other before they got married? I mean, if you're courting in a very kind of polite, lower middle class way, and you're not really left alone together, how do you know, basically?
Yes, I feel with Dickens sometimes is that his imagination was so enormous and vibrant. That sort of came first very much for him, and that when people then fell short of what he imagined them to be, he then reacted badly, you know. And I wonder whether there's an element of that he, with Catherine, he was so enamored to start with the idea of it all, and then it fizzled for him.
Yeah, and of course, you know, she had her baby so quickly. I worked out once that I think in the first 15 years of their marriage, she was pregnant for altogether 9 years of that time. But they had 10 kids. She had several miscarriages as well that we know of. It's incomprehensible to me. 9 years of being pregnant. I mean, just endless, awful kind of, you know, weird swimming hormonal mess that she must have been. And we think potentially that she suffered from some form of postpartum depression. There are occasional kind of references to her having real kind of emotional difficulties. Certainly later on, by the time she's got to whichever it is, baby number 9, they employed wet nurses. So presumably she struggled to feed as well. And yeah, it just all sounds sort of very joylessly productive. And Dickens was very, you know, the older children he seems to have really liked and been quite close to, and there are lots of kind of little anecdotes about them and how cute it is. And by the time he's getting to like baby number 7, baby number 8, he's like, there's another one.
Yes.
That's one of the very noticeable differences between now and then. We were talking earlier about how often people in the past actually are much more like us than we realise. But we can't really understand living in a society where we have pretty decent control over fertility and mostly have children because we choose to have them. I mean, having had this quite disrupted childhood, the unequal treatment where his elder sister Fanny sent off to the Academy of Music to kind of train there, I think that he has this kind of roseate idea of what family life will be and how fantastic it's going to be. And it turns out that it's not like that. And he's not necessarily a better father than his own father was. I mean, sure, he can provide financially, but his children are not necessarily closer to him. He very much has this tendency to sort of narrativize his own life as he's going along, and he'll go back and edit bits of it. After he's broken up with Catherine, it's a blank page. There's nothing on it, which is actually a really kind of quite chilling thing to be able to do to the mother of your 10 children.
Yes.
Even if it wasn't a kind of wildly happy marriage, you'd think that you'd still have some kind of residual sense of loss when it ended, simply because it had been going on for such a long time. And he never seems to have felt that. He created a narrative in which that had not happened.
So what I love about this conversation is that, and this is unlike any one that I've had so far, is that this book that you're writing obviously isn't published yet. So I'm trying to find clever ways of getting you to reveal as much as you possibly can. You must get so close to these people that you write about, spending all that time.
I think there are moments. I kind of went into it not loving Dickens as a person. I think if you have even the vaguest kind of feminist sensibility, then pretty clearly leaving your wife, possibly trying to get her locked up, just so you can get together with some teenage actress who is easily young enough to be your daughter and is in fact younger than several of your own children. It's not a good look. It doesn't endear you to people.
Yeah.
But I suppose two things really emerged for me as I was working on it. One was that there are obviously facts about his life which actually made a lot of his early life make a lot more sense. And even though it sort of just doesn't make him look any better, it almost makes him more kind of understandable. So for example, this refusal that he has to ever talk about Harriet, the thing is that by doing that, and by kind of not acknowledging that presumably, probably, his parents had this kind of extra load of anxiety about her health, about her needs, he makes their treatment of him when his father goes to debtor's prison, he makes that seem so much worse than it must have been. Yes, they've sorted out Fanny, the eldest daughter. The youngest children are small enough that they'll kind of cope with it okay. What are they going to do with the children in the middle? Harriet, who maybe needs care, can't possibly go and live in a debtor's prison if she has any kind of serious health issues. And that in those circumstances, you can kind of see how Charles kind of falls into the background a bit for them, that his needs maybe are not quite as prominent to them, that they have so many other concerns that seem larger and more urgent, and that by editing Harriet out, he makes his parents seem so much worse. He doesn't want to admit that his parents have this extra particular load of anxiety. So he brings himself more into the foreground by doing that when he's talking to Foster, his friend, his biographer, and when he's kind of shaping this very, I think, carefully arranged narrative that he sort of about the blacking factory, this secret that Forster then reveals after Dickens has died, and which stops everyone going on about Ellen Ternan and makes them all start talking about, oh, poor Dickens, what a terrible, terrible childhood he had. He makes himself seem so much more tragic and unnecessarily neglected. Whereas if he'd been more honest and given Forster, given then Forster's readers all the facts, maybe then you're a bit more sympathetic to his parents and you can kind of slightly more understand why the blacking factory with the cousins might have seemed like a good option. Maybe it's not so neglectful.
Yes,
as he wants everyone to think.
Is he? I just wondered. I mean, is he also disproportionately hard on his mother? Because there's that quote about saying, "I can't never forgive for the fact that she was warm for me." Going, you think, well, your dad wouldn't have been unaware of the arrangement, would he? I mean,
okay. The thing I find really, really interesting. So you'll again, this is one of these things you can kind of read in biography, but after biography, it's like, oh, he hated his mother. He really loved his dad still, but he hated his mum. And I'm like, well, I mean, let's just pause a minute here. So Dickens has 7 sons, all of them given many Christian names. Does he name any of them after his dad? No, he does not. Whereas his mother's family names and Christian name, he reuses for his daughters. And there are references in the letters. His mum gets invited to kind of special dinners and things. His dad doesn't so often. She comes and helps when Catherine has a new baby, certainly early on. I don't know that he actually resented her as much as he said he did. He actually seems to have got on okay with her, whereas I think there's a real like deep-seated resentment against his dad that he can't get over, and he doesn't want to acknowledge the difficulties that his dad might have been experiencing. He's very unforgiving, even from quite early on, about his father's behaviour. I mean, he clearly did love him because he was absolutely in pieces when his father died. They're actually quite upsetting letters to read. You can tell when he's genuinely emotional because his writing is like ugly. You can sort of see that there's real kind of emotion roiling under the surface. People don't seem inclined to kind of question the first biography, so Forster's biography. Basically like an authorised biography, right? So Dickens is
written by his best friend.
Written by his best mate, who's his literary executor. Forster's a bit weird because he's a bit of a he likes to get friendly with like famous writers. That's his thing. He's not that great a writer himself, but his list of friends is incredible. And they're, it's clearly kind of business-wise, at least, it's a very, very kind of intimate relationship. So Dickens sets Forster up to write this biography, basically. But the thing is that he's kind of clearly fed him all these little bits of information. And I am slightly dubious, having kind of double-checked a lot of actual facts, as to whether Forster's narrative of the blacking factory is entirely correct. Let's put it that way. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't get mentioned, that it's completely implausible Dickens wouldn't have known about. There are a lot of things that should come up and be mentioned and aren't. Enough to make you a little dubious about the exact reliability of that story as it stands. But there's gap after gap, there's inaccuracy after inaccuracy, and I find it really odd that no one has sort of said, well, hang on a minute, why are we necessarily believing in everything that Forster is telling us? There's this very odd tendency not to kind of question him. As soon as the story breaks, I guess, as soon as like Forster publishes this first volume, everyone acts as if it was a secret that Dickens wanted to keep private. And yet it kind of wasn't, because he specifically told Forster about it in the knowledge that Forster is going to write this biography one day. So if he didn't want people to know about it, then...
Had he sort of chosen his moment, though, to let people know? Is it that it makes him more heroic in terms of his progress if he's able to say at the end of his life that that's what he did?
I mean, this is the thing with Ellen Ternan as well. So obviously he lies through his teeth about Ellen. Her name gets bandied around a fair amount, actually. Certainly the Irish press outright name her. And there are lots of very, very heavy-handed hints in the English press about who she is. And so in his will, she's the first legatee, like the first legacy is her. Essentially, well, not essentially, I mean, actually admitting that for the previous 12 years that he'd been denying there was anything going on, clearly he was lying. That this is the two secrets that we think we've carefully discovered about Dickens that you'll find in that when they have newspaper stories, they're like, oh, these are Dickens' secrets. He didn't want anyone to know that he worked in a boot polish factory, and he didn't want anyone to know about his affair. And it's actually not true. He did clearly want people to know both those things.
Yes, it's almost that he wanted to control the narrative. So if there's a big public outrage against Ellen Ternan, then he's going to get cross and angry and defensive. But if they're in favour of it, then that's a different story. Is that the case? Possibly?
Yeah, well, I think it seems to me quite plausible that actually what he's, like we were saying, like create narratives, edit the past, try and control what people will kind of think of him and say of him in the future, which is an ongoing anxiety with him. So from writing the Pickwick Papers, someone offers him some information that he could put into the next bit of the Pickwick Papers. He's like, no, I'm not taking anything from anyone, because otherwise, when I'm dead, people will say that I didn't really write it, and I don't want that to be what people say about me. He's like 25. Like, it's a very odd thing for such a young man to come out with. It's why he burns it. One of the reasons that he burns a lot of his correspondence. When once Forster comes out with this, oh, poor, tragic young Charles, what you can see happening is public opinion kind of turning right round. It does a complete 180.
Yes, and just this conversation, Helena, has made me sort of think for the first time, because maybe I've quite come under the spell a little bit, is that the blacking factory, even though he was embarrassed to be there, it's not as bad as some of the places he could have ended up, is it? You know, at that time, surely.
I mean, it's not great, sure, but would it have been better for him to have moved into the Marshalsea? I mean, and presumably his parents were very keen for that not to happen, because they were worried that he would kind of fall in with bad company. So, I mean, it is, in all honesty, is sending him to live kind of under the eye of relations they were very close to. Is that such a weird and terrible thing for them to have done?
Yes, were they trying to even protect him, if what you're saying, that if he's having to stay at the Marshalsea at that age, being a boy as well?
There are all kinds of vulnerabilities that a 12-year-old boy might have. We tend to think of girls as being the ones who need cosseting and protecting, and he was apparently a very small boy. He definitely hadn't gone through puberty at that point, so he's still a little boy. Maybe that seemed like a nice, safe place that you go and send him to live with the cousins that he got on very well with. So they're actually a German Jewish family.
Right. And
his uncle is Matthew. Well, changes his name to Matthew. He's actually born Moses. And he joins the army as a surgeon's mate and kind of works his way up. And that's how come he's in Chatham, which is where he meets Dickens's Aunt Mary and marries her as his second wife. And that's where they acquire these kind of step-cousins, the Lammet step-cousins. James Lammet, who is this the cousin who supposedly takes the young Dickens to work at the blacking factory, also apparently makes him a little toy theatre, takes him to see plays. He turns out not to have existed. So there was no, Matthew Lammet didn't have a child called James. He had 6 children, and none of them were called James. If you can't even get either Forster or Dickens, can't get his cousin's name right. Forster has this very weird bit where he's like, oh, well, there was James, and then there was his cousin, and then there was another cousin. I'm like, no. There was not James. There was his older brother, and there was their brother-in-law, the husband of another of Dickens' step-cousins. It's another of those things that then kind of starts to chip away at your trust of this whole episode, if you like. I mean, is it that Dickens hadn't actually told Forster what their names were? Had he forgotten? It's all... I mean, I don't know. I don't have any cousins, so I don't know whether you'd kind of be likely to forget their names once you'd reached middle age.
No, I really don't think so. If any of my cousins are listening, I know you all.
Is it not just another fiction? Is it... Obviously, there's the episode in David Copperfield, which is a fictionalised version of this part of Dickens's life. Is what's in Forster's biography also a lightly fictionalised version of this bit of his life? I mean, is the reason that there are all these kind of inconvenient facts that stick holes through it because it's not actually meant to be true, because Dickens is... This is a kind of semi-autobiographical narrative that Dickens has come up with and shared with Forster and intends him to share with the world. And it's one which, in fact, has been quite carefully arranged and edited and kind of chopped and changed around so that he looks really super sympathetic, so that he is one of the tragic little boy heroes of his novel, and people can have that as the final view of him because you've already got Ellen out of the way. Everyone's already been kind of up in arms about her, and then this comes along and kind of washes kind of Victorian sexual morals away with Victorian sentimentality. And he did know what the Victorian public liked, after all. So are we so sure that that's not what he was trying to do? And you don't ever look at any of the other stuff, I suppose, and that's what I want to kind of
yes.
look at, the kind of other fictions that he composes about himself.
How far through are you then to completing this book? Do you have a title that you've shared at all, or a working title?
Well, its working title is the Life and Lives of Charles Dickens.
And do you call him Charles in this, or Charlie? How far do you go in the kind of?
I think I flip back and forth a little bit.
Yeah.
And I suppose I have kind of, you do develop a kind of intimacy, I suppose, when you're writing. You spend such a long time kind of, delving into their lives and trying to work out their kind of motivations and why they might have done things and what their feelings were and how they altered over time. I think I have kind of, possibly slightly grudgingly, come to a better understanding of him, I suppose, that by looking at the lies that he told about himself and these kind of fictional versions of his history that he circulates and encourages people to believe about him, he becomes, though not necessarily more attractive as a personality, he becomes much more comprehensible. He makes much more sense once you kind of fit certain of these facts into his life. And there is this kind of political unease with talking about a writer who says some really bad stuff and had some attitudes which were not really very nice. Although some of them change over time, of course.
Yeah, I was going to say about that because the charge of anti-Semitism in Oliver Twist, he modifies the text later on, doesn't he?
He does, and of course, in Our Mutual Friend, you have Mr. Rhea, who's the sort of super nice Jewish guy.
Yeah.
Also, so I was rereading A Tale of Two Cities, and it seemed to me, although this is something I'd have to kind of check with other people, I'm not sure that Miss Pross, so John Barsad's sister, who's like the governess companion to Lucy Manette, I think it seems to me anyway that we may be meant to understand that they are both of Jewish extraction as well.
Really? Okay.
I mean, I think plausibly. So one of the kind of anti-Semitic markers is an insistence on kind of red hair. There was this belief that people from a Jewish Ashkenazi background always had red hair, but both the Prosses are described as red-haired, and Barsad is compared to Judas. At one point, it says he really looked like Judas, famously red-haired, of course. There were a couple of references which make it possible, I think, that contemporary readers would have understood these are people from a Jewish background, probably who've converted. And that, again, would be a much more, well, at least a kind of only partially horribly anti-Semitic presentation. It's a kind of, it's split, isn't it? I guess that Barsad is awful, but Miss Pross is actually really quite nice and sort of, has her own brand of heroism. And it certainly is something that is kind of movable, I would suggest. I mean, Ellen as well has Jewish relatives. She, it turns out, probably again spent quite a lot of her teens living in Rochester with her uncle. She was born there, and her uncle settled there. But his wife's family were Jewish, and she had several kind of relatives in the area who we know that Ellen and her sisters kind of interacted with quite frequently. Yeah, certainly over time, Dickens's attitudes seem to have moved around a bit, and whether that's growing up where he did in Docklands, I mean, they always had through the whole of that period quite substantial Jewish populations. So the anti-Semitism is almost kind of quite an unnatural thing for someone from a Navy background to express, because a lot of the people who would lend you money as a sailor, they were very often from Jewish backgrounds. And I mean, there were plenty of Jewish people living in Chatham when Dickens was a boy there. So it's not entirely clear where the anti-Semitism would necessarily have come from, and whether it's just a kind of cultural growth, if you like, in a way, but it's sort of not personal at all.
But the idea about him changing, I think, changing his opinion, that must be quite hard as a biographer, actually. And whenever you're looking at anybody, that you can seize on a letter, and you think, well, it could be just that letter could just represent one tweet from one moment in time, and he would never want to stand by it beyond that hot-headed kind of response.
Well, and I mean, there's a particularly unpleasant letter in which he makes some horrible remarks that I'm not going to repeat here about Hindu people. But as you say, that's kind of in the immediate context of reports coming back about the Indian uprising, and one of his sons was out there with the army, and so and obviously there were lots of reports of kind of atrocities. And was that his considered opinion? It's not a letter that reads well, but if he'd lived longer, would we have had a Hindu Mr. Rhea? I guess a kind of, a sort of apologetic writing of his own previous sort of racist outburst. Maybe not. Maybe that's what you're getting in The Mystery of Edwin Drood with the landless twins, who there seems to be an indication that they're partly Sinhalese. Are they? Aren't they? What would Dickens have done with them? I mean, we don't know, of course. You have these two very kind of set poles in Dickens' biography, that we have the bad grown-up Dickens and innocent young Dickens. And one of the things I'm trying to do is to sort of get from one to the other, and neither of those maybe is completely accurate.
Yes.
People's personalities aren't fixed. I think Austen almost doesn't exist publicly, whereas Dickens, of course, once he's famous, you can do that almost every day. The journeys he's made when he arrives at a hotel. It's like, oh, Mr. Charles Dickens has arrived at this hotel. You can understand why he would want to keep a kind of private self, and why he would construct a kind of narrative of who he was that would act as a sort of mask or a shield for himself, because he was very exposed. And there's the weird bit with his stalker. Yeah,
I don't know this. No, I didn't know he had a stalker.
No, you probably do. I mean, I'm sure you're some of your listeners will be familiar with it. So there's this just before he goes off to Genoa, and basically it's a story which shows, I think, how much his fame kind of warped stuff around him, because he takes this guy to court. Basically, he supports the prosecution of a man called Walker.
It's a great name for a stalker, isn't it? Walker. I mean, it's
who he'd been giving financial assistance to. So this guy had written to him and been like, oh, I'm in great want. Can you help me at all? And he'd been helping with his rent, clothes, and food and stuff. But then the kind of demands kept coming, and then the guy was like, oh, well, my wife's died, and I'm going to kill my kids, basically, if you don't give me more money. At which point, basically, Dickens hands matters over to the authorities. And it turns out the guy's wife isn't dead. And Walker's been they were very, very weirdly threatening letters, and there were a lot of them. And so off they all trot to the police court. Walker's in the dock. Dickens explains the circumstances, hands over the letter, and explains what he did. He hadn't been a complete loon. He'd sent his brother to kind of check out the guy's story initially, and he'd been really kind to him. I mean, he got begging letters all the time. There was no real reason why he had to kind of open his wallet for this guy. But anyway, he had done. But the weird thing is, the guy was clearly guilty, right? That he'd basically been obtaining money on false pretenses, and there was this sort of the prosecution was helped along by this kind of anti-mendicity society. But the guy's found not guilty, and they then collect money for him in the courtroom, and then Dickens kind of comes out and he's like, in his letters afterwards, he's like, I don't really understand how I became the baddie. The guy was pretty unhinged, I think. I mean, Walker doesn't seem to have been entirely in control of how he behaved and what he did. And obviously, because Dickens, like his dad, liked to put birth announcements in the papers, he knew what street Dickens lived in. It's really astonishing to think about what a kind of exposed society it was. There you are, clearly kind of a bit obsessed with Dickens, a bit kind of focused on him. He can turn up outside your door. It seems to me pretty obvious that actually what had happened there was that everyone in the courtroom had read Oliver Twist and the bit with the evil magistrate. And they'd be like, oh, well, we don't want to be in a Dickens novel as a baddie. And the guy was pretty clearly guilty. Like Walker had lied and been making kind of these unhinged threats. And it was not the case that Dickens had kind of done anything wrong. And yet Walker's allowed to go free.
Yes, it's a sort of a poetic justice that he's slightly punished by his goodness in this case, not something bad he's done. Well, that's extraordinary. Walker the Stalker, then.
Yeah.
A real life awful person. But when can we expect the book to be published then?
I'm not quite sure. Publishing schedules have all gone a bit haywire with the old COVID. But I published some stuff in kind of things like the Dickensian and Dickens Quarterly and things. So it is sort of, if anyone's interested in a little kind of taster, then there's little snippets.
Yes. People listening to this will definitely be interested, and hopefully they'll log off this chat and go and look right now. That's been extraordinary, Helena. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and it was lovely to chat.
Bye for now. Thank you for listening to Charles Dickens' A Brain on Fire. I want to keep adverts off this podcast, so if you're enjoying these episodes and would like to make a small donation, please follow the link in the description wherever you're listening to this, and you can buy us a coffee. All contributions make a huge difference. And I'd also like to thank Kevin Quinn, Dawn, Edward G. Pettit, David Perdue, Jennifer Emerson, Beth Houston, Roma, and all other anonymous sponsors for your support so far. See you next time.